Tonight, farewell to Gough Whitlam. Australia mourns the passing of a political giant who changed our nation forever. The heart-stopping moment a 10-tonne truck ploughed into a line of cars. How did everyone survive? The boy from Bankstown who's become the face of jihadi terror. Moment of truth, Oscar Pistorius finds out if he'll go to jail. And the Kangaroos showing off all their tricks ahead of the Four Nations.
This is 9 News with Peter Overton.
Good evening. It's been many years since we've seen and felt firsthand the powerful personality of Gough Whitlam, his great wit and charm and towering presence. Fading health has kept him from the public eye for the past few years, but today all the memories came flooding back as we learnt of his death and relived a defining era in Australian politics. Political editor Laurie Oakes begins our coverage.
At the beginning was hope. A change of government after 23 years. All too soon, hope was dashed by the drama of the dismissal.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
The period in between was a roller coaster ride that shook up every aspect of Australian life.
He was only Prime Minister for 3 years, 3 tumultuous years, but those years changed our nation.
Political martyrdom tends to dominate discussion of Gough Whitlam's Prime Ministership, but today, with his death, attention was focused on the achievements. Figures from all sides of politics acknowledging him as a political giant.
Gough Whitlam was a man for the ages and a giant of his time.
In every sense, Gough Whitlam was a giant figure in this parliament and in our public life.
Even Malcolm Fraser, the Liberal leader who used the Senate to block supply bills and bring about the sacking of the Whitlam government on the 11th of November 1975.
It was a fierce political battle.
Did not want to dwell on those events.
It's a time to remember the good things Gough did in his public life.
How would you describe some of his greatest achievements?
Well, they were substantial. They changed the way Australia looked at itself in significant ways. It was a more open society and in some ways a more questioning society.
Edward Gough Whitlam, whose father became Commonwealth Solicitor General, was born in Melbourne, spent his school days in Sydney and Canberra, then went to Sydney University where he met and married Margaret Dovey. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, he enlisted in the RAAF as a navigator in a bomber squadron known as the Devil's Brothers. An attempt by wartime Labor Prime Minister John Curtin to reform the Constitution aroused his interest in politics. After a period practising law and with a young family, Mr Whitlam entered federal parliament at a by-election for the outer Sydney seat of Werriwa in 1952. He became deputy leader to Arthur Calwell in 1960 and then leader after the ALP's devastating defeat in the 1966 Vietnam War election. I first met Gough Whitlam in 1967 and covered his battles to reform the Labor Party and make it fit to govern, while he simultaneously laid out for voters a detailed program of reform. His motto was crash through or crash. I was there with him in a room at the Sunnybrook Motel in Cabramatta on election night 1972 when the bloke operating the computer said, "I think we can send the white smoke up the chimney now." Mr Whitlam cracked a bottle of champagne.
Does the job frighten you at all, sir?
Not in the least.
He hardly paused for breath, immediately forming an interim two-person ministry with his deputy, Lance Barnard, sharing all 27 portfolios between them. In a whirlwind fortnight, they abolished national service, withdrew Australian troops from Vietnam, banned racially selected sporting teams from visiting Australia, established diplomatic relations with communist China, took the first steps towards Aboriginal land rights, and set up inquiries into the financial needs of state and church schools. When a full ministry was sworn in, the reformist pace hardly slackened. Measures ranging from free universities to equal pay for women, from welfare payments for single-parent families to establishment of the family court.
It's to Gough Whitlam that we owe the existence of Medicare and the removal from poorer Australians of what was the financial tragedy for many of them of sickness or hospitalisation.
Legislation providing for universal health insurance was pushed through a historic joint sitting of the House of Representatives and the Senate after the coalition forced a double dissolution election and lost in 1974. Economic conditions deteriorated though, and brashness and boldness morphed into a corner-cutting, risky style of government that gave rise to scandals, giving Malcolm Fraser the excuse he needed.
We will use the power vested in us by the Constitution and delay the passage of the government's money bills through the Senate.
As the money ran out, Governor-General Sir John Kerr caused one of the greatest shocks in Australian political history by sacking the Whitlam government, making Mr Fraser caretaker Prime Minister and ordering an election. Labor was beaten in a landslide. 2 years later, after another devastating election defeat, Mr Whitlam retired to become the Labor Party's greatest folk hero. But he didn't lose his sense of humour, as he showed years later when asked about life after politics.
I'm a full-time elder statesman.
When Margaret Whitlam died in 2012, he was desolate, declaring simply, "She was the love of my life." Summing up the Whitlam legacy, Paul Keating said today, he snapped Australia out of the Menzian torpor, the orthodoxy that had rocked the country to sleep. This is how the man himself viewed it on the 40th anniversary of the It's Time campaign launch.
A more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. These values are at the heart of the Whitlam legacy.
Vale, Gough. I don't think many will disagree.
And Laurie joins us now from Canberra. Laurie, good evening. It's hard to imagine the public responding to any other politician in the way they have to Gough Whitlam.
Yes, Pete, it is. But Gough Whitlam was a larger-than-life figure. He was at the centre of some of the most dramatic political events the country's ever seen. And Sir John Kerr guaranteed him folk hero status, not just by sacking him, but by doing it in a cowardly and devious way. That made Mr Whitlam a martyr. All that, plus the big reforms that his government brought about, explain why he has a very strong hold on the public imagination. Gough Whitlam was a divisive figure. People loved or loathed him. And as Prime Minister, he didn't take as much interest in economic matters as he should have done, and he failed to manage his cabinet closely enough. But he was daring. He would put a case to voters and fight for it. He didn't indulge in the bland, wishy-washy poly-speak that we got used to these days. He was gutsy and he was engaging.
All right, Laurie, everyone, of course, who met him had a favourite story about him. You knew him very well. What's your abiding memory of the man?
Well, my abiding memory is of his wit. Gough Whitlam was funny and he was wicked. He'd been the star of satirical reviews as a student at university, and he was a natural comedian. In the 1972 campaign, for example, a minister called on the Labor Party to give Prime Minister Billy McMahon a fair go. I'm prepared to go halfway, Gough shot back. We'll be fair and he can go. His speeches were peppered with lines like that. Another of his lines was, I'm a man of few words, but they're memorable ones. Well, they were, Pete.
They were. Laurie, thank you very much. Thanks. Now, these are live pictures from Canberra of the Labor caucus marching to Old Parliament House to pay their respects as a group. It tops off what's been an emotional day with federal parliament suspended so politicians from both sides could pay tributes to and share their memories of Gough Whitlam.
Flowers, handwritten tributes and thank yous on the steps of Old Parliament House, and the tears of one woman shed for so many. Under a flag at half-mast, today's generation of Labor MPs filed into a party meeting, rarely, if ever, with such heavy hearts. Watched over by the man who forever changed the party.
Our country is different because of him. Gough's light shines before him, and the memory of his great works will live long in the heart of our nation.
No one in the room was closer to Gough than Senator John Faulkner, the man who carries the modern Labor torch Gough Whitlam lit so long ago.
For so many of us, and it's what makes it so hard, he was a great friend and mentor.
There was a minute's silence, yet so much more to be said as MPs, Labor, Liberal and National honoured, praised, celebrated Gough Whitlam.
The outpouring of grief that we are witnessing today is not just mourning for a man, but for everything that he represented.
I have no doubt that he's there with Margaret. One of the things we can be happiest about today is the fact that that old couple are no longer apart.
Parliament was suspended for the day. Respect for a man who decades ago towered over it.
Gough, my friend and comrade, rest in peace.
Lane Kelcart, 9 News.
And reporter Mark Burrows joins us now from the Sydney Town Hall. Mark, have we heard from the Whitlam family today?
Well, Peter, Gough Whitlam's children issued a statement today saying he was a loving and generous father. He was a source of inspiration to us, our families and to millions of Australians. They indicated there'll be a private cremation, and the speculation has now turned to the location of a planned public memorial service. Could it be here at the Sydney Town Hall? Maybe the Opera House. After all, Gough was not known to be a true believer. Maybe the Blacktown Civic Centre, where he launched his famous 1972 It's Time campaign. One Labor MP cheekily suggested the SCG or Homebush Stadium to hold in the crowds. Any service will have touches the man himself requested, and expect flashes of the famous Whitlam wit. Like this pearl. He was once asked what he would do when he met his maker. Gough replied, "I'll treat him as an equal." Peter?
Nice line. Mark, thank you. And Tracy Grimshaw will have an exclusive one-on-one with Bob Hawke in a special tribute to Gough Whitlam on A Current Affair tonight at 7 o'clock. To the